Hello and welcome back to Behind the Grind. We are now into season number 4, and on today's show, we got a man that not only steals signs, but he steals bananas too. And you can find him on the Ship Chasing there, one of the most premier shows out there in Fantasyland. He is often imitated, but never duplicated. He is the one and only Ben Gretch. How you doing, Ben?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, I'm glad to finally kind of get this out there, get this show. This is what I've been waiting to do for quite some time right now. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a heads up. I may have talked to some people that run in your circles when I put this show sheet together. So just be aware of that. So hopefully most of them said good things about you for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, you got me definitely on the curious side now. Who said what? And I'm excited to find out.
There's one really good one in here. I can't wait to kind of dive into a little bit because it has my interest peaked a little bit. It's like that. What's that one meme there from Leonardo DiCaprio? You had my interest, now you have my intrigue or something, or whatever that works. It's kind of like that kind of gif here right now. But we start every show off with the basic question. What would your intro music be if you were coming to a WWE ring, or if you're coming into the 9th inning to close out a ball game, or even your walk-up song in a baseball game? What would that intro music be for you?
Let's say the Tecmo Super Bowl theme song. I did a very short-lived solo podcast, 7 or 8 years ago, and I had an intro theme song based off the old Nintendo game Tecmo Super Bowl. And I thought that was pretty sweet. So I think that's a kind of a curveball answer, but I think that's kind of a fun one.
You know, it kind of gives that little bit of a nostalgia type feel to it. You're talking football, kind of kicks it back a little bit. I mean, a lot of us, I might be dating myself here a little bit, but that early 90s video game experience, that kind of hit a little bit different. Like I remember playing, as long as it's not the duck hunt game. I talked about this just the other day with Fensterman and how that dog just kind of basically, you know why we are the way we are in our generation? Why we don't trust anybody? It's because that stupid dog holding up the 2 ducks every time laughing at you. That's why we have trust issues. And it's all thanks to those early 90s video games. Now, if there's one thing, that's great, but we all have a guilty pleasure type song. Maybe something that people don't realize. Maybe a song that we're not too proud to admit that we actually enjoy listening to. Is there one of those songs out there that kind of sticks into your head regardless if you want to listen to it or not?
Man, that list would be really long for me. So I have family from Montana. I listened to a lot of country growing up. I know a lot of people don't like country. But I also listened to a lot of like rock and roll. I listened to a lot of 80s stuff. When I was in high school, it was rap. So, I mean, probably the answer would be some type of rap song that sticks in my head, you know, like a Tupac or an Eminem or something from when I was in high school. But man, that list would be really long. I don't have a problem singing along to any genre of music. So I mean, I could start throwing out all sorts of names. Oh, I mean, AC/DC, like Thunderstruck, like that always gets me jazzed. That would be one for sure.
You know what was funny? We went up to a basketball tournament. My son plays basketball, and I got the Sirius XM radio going on, and it's set on prime country. I'm from just north of Montana here in Alberta. So I mean, we got the Calgary Stampede that kicks in every once in a while. I've still got my cowboy hat, my boots, all that fun stuff. So I got my country music, a little bit of rock. So I could feel that on a few different levels. Now let's talk about sports. How did you get into sports as a youth? What were some of your sports that you kind of played that you excelled at, or maybe didn't excel at but still enjoyed playing?
I played baseball more than any other sport. My older brother ended up playing college baseball at Lewis Clark State for legendary coach Ed Sheff. And it was a big thing in my family. He was really good. We'd go to these camps, scouts and stuff. And so learned a lot of the more advanced techniques and those types of things, and certainly took the game a lot more serious on the baseball side in my family. But I always gravitated more towards football. I was never great at basketball or soccer or anything like that. I was never really an endurance guy. I didn't run cross country or anything. It was like these sports like baseball and football where I could sprint and then breathe really heavily for a little bit and then sprint some more. Those are my types of sports. Always played a lot of golf, all that stuff. But yeah, football was the one I gravitated towards, but it wasn't very popular in my area. My high school, I think the couple years before I went to high school, they went winless when I was in middle school. And then I think for my 4 years in high school, they won like a total of like 5 games or something. Like, I mean, it was one of those things that like in my area, it wasn't the cool thing to do to play football. But I had at one point 3 different tackle football pickup games going. I had the kids my grade, the kids a grade older than me, and then the Sunday game with my older brothers, where I was like the youngest one. Me and my stepbrother, who's about my age, were the 2 young ones that would play with our older brothers and their friends, and we're playing full on tackle football on Sundays. Going over watching the morning games and then going out and playing football. So I played a lot of football growing up, but I didn't play. I played on the middle school team. I didn't play in high school. I played baseball in high school, but just absolutely fell in love with football, the X's and O's, the strategy of it all. Played a lot of the old football video games, old NCAA football, all that stuff. Learned a lot of what I know about X's and O's from some of those games, from Madden, some of those games in the early 2000s and late 90s. But yeah, I used to just absolutely love the sport of football. That was the sport that I cared the most about. After high school and all that, I played a lot of flag football, both in college, and then after college, I was in a pretty competitive. They called it. You could play more physically. It was a flag football league, but you could play. It was basically they called it full contact flag football, which was like, there wasn't tackling, but everything else was allowed. There was a full on blocking. We had like offensive lines and stuff. So all that stuff. And I was like played quarterback and designed our offenses and called our plays. And I loved the nuances of the game. And yeah, we won the Seattle City Championship one year. It's kind of cool. So, for me, it was football and baseball.
I love that you mentioned the whole full-on tackle flag football, because
yeah,
isn't that usually how flag football starts? Someone takes maybe a little bit of a reach, maybe a little extra contact, and then it kind of escalates down the road and kind of snowballs from there. I mean, we would start as flag football, then eventually it turned into pick up and go, and then basically turned into a rugby match back in the day. Now
we played against some guys that were big and athletic, like former college D linemen, and like I said, there's full on offensive lines and blocking, and I would talk a little crap, and these guys wouldn't like it, and so I drew a number of roughing the passer penalties. These guys would take some blindside shots on you, and they would just full on lay you out. I mean, they'd take the penalty because why not? It was so. It was you'd still wake up sore the next day, even though it was flag football.
Well, those guys know that you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. I mean, that's how you got to set that tone out there. Now, maybe that's one of those lessons you learned along the way through sports. Maybe not run that mouth so much when you're going against 300-pound guys that can run a 4.5 40. But sports always teaches us a lesson that we tend to carry with us our entire lives. Was there any particular thing through baseball or football, through a coach or whatever that looked like, that kind of stuck with you to this day?
That's super, super easy for me. It's all the leadership stuff. I think the way to the teamwork, I think the way to articulate my favorite leadership related concept is you have to meet people where they are. Everybody has different types of responses to, there are people that are only motivated by like negative reinforcement. You have to tell them they are bad. Like you have to, challenge them to be better, and they will. And then there's other people that aren't motivated that way at all. They need the positive reinforcement, right? And then there's, that it's not just negative and positive. There's a whole lot of other gray areas in between. There's it's important to find ways to communicate and meet people where they are. I always thought I loved about team sports, and I always thought was really important about team sports. And after, I was done playing organized, and the latest that I played organized sports was in high school, where we had coaches, and I went on to play all these, flag football leagues I was talking about, and other recreational sports leagues, softball, whatever. I was always kind of a guy that would be not our coach or anything, but a little bit, somebody who's a little bit more in the know, a little bit more of somebody who's kind of helping us organize things, because you have players on the team in these types of situations that we don't have a coach that have to help, who's going to play what position, how are we going to do this? And that was something that I always really enjoyed, I guess, was being that type of person. And for people who weren't as comfortable and maybe didn't play the sports growing up. Like when we played in some, like in college, some of our intramural guys were, soccer players and tennis players growing up. They weren't football players. They didn't even really know the sport. And it was tough. It's tough for some people to even admit, like, hey, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing in this situation. Being able to meet people where they are and understand the stuff that they're already naturally, because some of those types of people already have some crazy natural instincts and like understand what they're actually going to be really good at naturally. They have the instinctual stuff, and then what stuff that they are going to need to be coached up on a little bit that seems to come natural for you. And you got to kind of try to understand how that's harder for them. It's difficult for them to understand. Like, think about like one of my buddies, every time I'd have him run a crossing route in the shallow part of the field, he would just sprint across the field. It's one of those things where you do need to like throttle it down and like if you're open, you don't need to just keep running through zones. I shouldn't have to lead you because he's fast. I shouldn't have to lead you out of bounds on a little shallow crosser just to get you the ball. Like you should run fast after you catch the ball and are going upfield. But when you're just running across the field 3 to 5 yards downfield, you don't need to be sprinting 100 miles an hour, especially if there's nobody really following you or you've already beat your man. And so it's that kind of thing where for me as as somebody who watched football my whole life, I was like, yeah, I mean, you got to, once you get open, you got to make yourself available to catch the ball. That kind of comes naturally. But for other people who aren't that obsessed with football, that's a kind of a concept that doesn't immediately come naturally. And so you have to figure out, how do I communicate this? How do I understand their perspective on it? I think there's a lot of life lessons from that about understanding other people's perspectives, where they're at, meeting them where they're at, how they think about things, how they perceive the world. We all have our own kind of paradigms and those types of things. That type of stuff, from a leadership perspective is it's just so valuable for team sports. And it's something that it's permeated every other element of my entire life.
Yeah, so go back to these intramurals. Go back to Ben Gretch as a kid here, because I know for me, growing up here, we had the Canadian Football League. I mean, I was introduced to the CFL long before the NFL. I remember the 1989 Grey Cup game between the Hamilton Ticats and the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And anytime I'd step on the field playing with my buddies, I became Donald Narcisse, wide receiver extraordinaire. So when you stepped on that field, when you crossed those lines, who was Ben Gretch? What was that player for you?
It's funny, when I was playing the pickup games when I was younger and kind of doing the make-believe and all that stuff, I wasn't the quarterback usually. I was usually, I was a little brother and all that stuff. So I was a wide receiver, but I always thought I had really good hands. It was Chris Carter for the Vikings. I was a Vikings fan growing up. Great little route runner, super reliable hands, the toe taps on the sideline. I'd always, I'll throw one over here, over by the sideline. Let me show you. I can tap my toes on the sideline and get my feet in, drag my feet. He was so incredible at that. The guy that Chris Berman used to always say, all he does is catch touchdowns, right? It wasn't the most athletic receiver in the league or anything like that. I was, like I said, again, like the younger brother in a lot of these situations. So I had to be wily, a little more nuanced in my routes and in finding space, and then always catch the ball, be reliable hands and body control and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think it was definitely Chris Carter.
All right. Well, hopefully he taught you to always have a fall guy, because I mean that's probably the biggest thing that he taught anyone in the NFL at the rookie symposium. Now I got to know this, because this kind of came through here from one of your acquaintances asked me to ask about the UW helmet there in the background, and if it ever gets used as a prop on live streams. So what's the story with the UW helmet?
The UW helmet I got from a buddy who got it at a garage sale, probably still in high school. He's just one of those good friends who I've been going to UW football games since I was like 10 or 11. So even among high school friends, I was known as being a pretty huge Huskies football fan, maybe more so than others were. And my dad had gotten season tickets around that time and kept them up until I went off to college. And then I went to UW and I didn't apply anywhere else. I had good enough grades and SAT scores. They told me you don't even really need a fallback plan. You're going to get in, my advisors. And so I was like, well, I'm not applying anywhere else. That's where I want to go. And so I went to UW and I got my own student tickets. And then after I graduated, I got my own tickets. So I had season tickets in one way or another for all the way up until the pandemic year is when I was, we weren't able to go to the games anymore. But I've always been a huge fan of that team. And that's where a huge part of my love of college football started, was going down to Husky Stadium. It's an incredible atmosphere. I still remember, I think it was one of my very first games. We lost to Arizona. Ortiz Jenkins did a front flip. He got hit, front flip into the end zone. Some people will remember that really old highlight. Remember watching Brock Ewart and Jerome Pathon, and those are the first years of my Husky football memories. But a buddy bought me that from a garage sale. I threw it on the shelf. It's a pretty good little background prop, but I've thrown it on at a couple of the ship chasing streams before. It has gotten use. It has been jammed onto my head. The first we get a little loose over at ship chasing. We'll drink a little bit sometimes, stuff like that, especially the long draft streams that are 4 hours. I think that's the first time I threw it on. And the chat, I know at one point we do some Thursday night football watch-alongs as well. The chat this year was like, if something happens, if we hit on some of our picks, we do some underdog pick'ems for the games. The helmet's got to go on, and so we've made little bets like that before. And if we've hit on certain picks, the helmets had to come on. My wife was making fun of me because I didn't even have the AirPods the first time I threw it on, and I had because of my wires got caught on the helmet. I knocked my headphones out, and then I was trying to put the headphones in through the helmet. I mean, when we've had a couple beers on stream, you can wind up looking like an idiot when you try to throw a helmet on and then figure out the audio. It wasn't great. I looked like a dummy.
Hey, I'm all for that. Hey, I've made myself look like a dummy more than once or twice here. Now, when we go but talk about, maybe that wasn't your best decision that you made, but tell me about a decision that kind of changed the trajectory of your life in the industry. Because I look at the industry, Rotoviz and CBS, all these big time companies you kind of work for, but you've had to make a decision at one point. What was that biggest one that kind of changed how you got to where you're going?
That's a good question. It felt like kind of a fairly consistent, steps on a ladder type thing. There were points at which I wasn't really growing as much anymore, and it wasn't worth the time commitment and energy and effort. And then something else would always kind of seem to come available that I could attach myself to and get after. I mean, maybe the first big decision was the one when I decided to leave Rotoviz and go to Roto Grinders. They offered me a pretty nice package to help them build out, Roto Grinders is a DFS site, but help them build out what was going to be a season-long vertical under the old Fantasy Insiders brand. But that only made it the 1 year. It was tough to transition. It had previously been a DFS brand. I was really proud of the work that we did at that site, but just didn't really catch on. Didn't really get the support and do the numbers that we were hoping for. But making that decision to go, out and try out a new company and all of those things ultimately led to CBS, which is kind of the easy answer, but I think for anyone who would get lucky enough to get offered that type of a position, I know there was, over 100. I can't remember exactly how many applicants for the job I was looking for. And I was lucky enough to be selected, and, taking that opportunity and trying to make my name through a company as big as CBS and getting the opportunity to reach that big of an audience and all of those things is an easy answer as well for this question for my journey. But yeah, I think the Roto Grinders thing was kind of a stepping stone to that opportunity. And that opportunity was a huge one. And then as the pandemic hit and things were a little bit unstable with CBS, I ended up going off on my own. And so that would be the other big one, is launching my own newsletter and all that. But people that read my newsletter and listen to my stuff know that, I call myself an entrepreneur by happenstance. It wasn't really I'm making a bet on myself. It was more like I was kind of lost in the situation in 2020 and decided to go out there and try it out. And luckily the community has been really great to me. And I've been able to make a full-time thing out of having sort of my own product and my own brand. And so that's the other big one. That's hey, going off on my own is probably the most obvious answer to this question. But as I think back through my journey and as I was living it, each time I made these decisions, it wasn't oh, I'm making a big, choice here. It was more this is sort of the where things are leading me. It was more reactionary than I think it's easy to say that, I planned this all out and I mapped this all out, but it's not exactly the way that it went.
Going solo, especially that first time, I mean, that's a scary proposition. I mean, you don't know how you can believe in your talent all you want, but making that step and making that decision, how did you, because you said you just kind of reacted, everything was kind of more reactionary, just kind of go for it. How did you come to that thing? Like, I'm going to go solo. Like that's a big step for a lot of people that are looking for that security.
So, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, so it really had a lot to do with the pandemic. I got the initial offer from CBS. I knew, and my bosses knew, that when I accepted that offer, that it wasn't, I have a wife and 2 kids. It wasn't financially where I needed it to be, but it was a 1-year deal, and we were hoping for that to grow. And everyone knew, and that was the plan. The pandemic hit over the course of that 1 year, and then it wasn't really in the cards for big promotions or big raises at that time at CBS. At the same time, I had a betting company reach out to me, Odds Checker, and I'll be eternally grateful from that for what they did. Was they offered me a really competitive, strong, better than competitive, sort of just per article rate to do freelance work for them. And at the time, CBS was like, that's fine. You can do this in addition to our work. But it was enough that it was going to be, financially put me in a pretty good position for that football season in 2020. Even if I wasn't with CBS anymore. And so that offer is really what created this opening where my decision was like, yeah, I could try to do both things, but the CBS job was a lot of hours and a lot of time. And that's the way that it is. I mean, it's a very prestigious job, and I loved it and really enjoyed that team there. And man, I would have stayed there forever. If everything lined up perfectly, I would have stayed at CBS. I'd still be there today. Jamie, Dave, Heath, Adam Azer, Chris Towers is the guy that hired me. Is an incredible human being. All of those guys, all the guys behind the scenes are just awesome, awesome human beings. I got to go meet them all in person multiple times. Still get am lucky enough to be a guest somewhat regularly on their podcasts and chat with them. And like I said, something that felt like a really cool fit, and I would have been there forever if I could have. But it just, because of the pandemic and because it's a big, big company, like somebody like me that was sort of an entry level person that had just been hired a year earlier wasn't the priority. Like no one really knew what was going to happen from there. And so I had to, consider a lot of things. And the thing that I decided for 2020 was that I would leave CBS, do the sports betting stuff to make some immediate income. And then, because that would free up a lot of time, because it was just freelance work, use the other time to find a full-time job or a new path outside of content creation and football was actually the plan during the 2020 season. But people really loved my Stealing Signals article. And I actually had multiple people reach out to me and tell me, hey, you should at least do this as some type of one-off thing. And the suggestion that really made a lot of sense, 2 people told me, there's this Substack, is this new newsletter company. Think about starting a newsletter. It would be a really good fit for what you do in this article that you write, the Stealing Signals article. And so literally, like the day before week 1, I started the Substack on Saturday, the day before Sunday of week 1 in 2020. I wasn't able to monetize for that first week or the first edition because there were some issues with getting everything hooked up. And then I turned into a premium Substack, and it was like, at first it was like, I don't know, $5 a month or something to sign up. And I got an incredible amount of support and signups and all that stuff. And I've been able to grow it and do a lot more with it. The next year I was able to do off-season content and rankings and all of that kind of stuff, which was really a big step and helped grow the thing even larger, because people really loved the in-season content, but being able to build it into something that hits on a lot of different, both draft and in-season, related content was pretty huge as well. And it grew really quickly. I mean, the answer to your last question about the big decision I made, I mean, I started to get buyout offers right away. And then I talked to some people that were, better with these kinds of business decisions than me, including one of my brothers, and who was kind of an advisor for me on some of the stuff. But I probably the biggest decision I made was, at one point I got a big offer from another big, a big site, not CBS, but that type of site. And it was the kind of deal that I would have described as being my dream job in the industry before I had started to have a lot of success with the newsletter. And one of the big reasons I didn't take it was, my brother helping me understand, like, you are your own boss at this point. You've grown something. You're doing something that a lot of people that are in really stable business jobs, like in his industry, would kill to be where you're at right now, growing something on your own where you can't be fired. You can't be, have certain responsibilities or things taken away from you. You get to make all of those decisions for yourself. And that is a luxury and a freedom. And there's a lot of uncertainty with that, but you really should continue to bet on yourself. That was like after a year of doing the newsletter where I made the bigger bet on myself because I turned down an offer that was a really, really competitive one. And then after that season, the 2021 season, I got an even better offer that I ultimately turned down as well from a different site, which was really hard a second time, but it also validated the first decision, which was exactly what my brother told me. Is like, you have to lean into uncertainty, but that second offer comes and you're like, man, I leaned into uncertainty and I got an even better offer 6 months later. I mean, obviously there's upside with this if you lean into it a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about this stuff in a while, but you reflect on it and it's wild to wind up where you are.
Yeah, it sounds like betting on yourself was the route to go. I mean, when you get in these offers, you got to feel like you're doing something right if these guys are all coming to you. And I kind of brings me to a nice little segue to the next question, because one of those articles you kind of wrote there on the Stealing Signals there about 5 months ago on the Substack was the evolution of fantasy football, which was kind of you talked a little bit about the medical aspect. We're not going to talk about the medical here, but I just think the evolution of fantasy football kind of moves into nicely how I want to go with talking about your journey, some of the biggest changes or evolutions from when you first started to where we are today in the industry as a whole.
Like evolutions for the industry specifically or for myself?
Well, even just for yourself and for the industry, because, I mean, you talk about the DFS. That's been a huge change from when a lot of people started to where we are now. And I know you guys do a lot of stuff there, the DFS type aspect. And what would be the biggest change that you've seen from day one when you got into right now?
I mean, there's a lot. There's been a lot of changes in my time in the industry. DFS, I started doing stuff at Rotoviz in 2015 was my first article. Really started being a pretty big contributor in the 2016 calendar year. And like DFS was just, in its young ages at that point. I think 2015 is when you had the Ethan Gate and all that. And then 2016, 2017, very popular, but had to get regulated more and some things changed. And obviously more recently you have the advent of sports betting and legalization of sports betting in the US and all these states. And that's been a massive shift in things. I think it's had an impact on DFS, because rather than having to, for a lot of people who maybe aren't good at DFS, rather than having to play against other humans, I can just bet against the book more directly. Dynasty was something that was, I think, relatively young when I was starting, and I got pretty into it. And now I think it's starting to probably get hit a little bit at this stage by best ball, which is like the other big one. And you talk about the evolution of the industry. Best ball has gotten so massive and is, it's such a fun way to play it. Like we know there's a lot of chaos in fantasy football in any year. We know there's a lot of injuries. There's a lot of stuff that's really difficult to predict. Team level stuff that's very difficult to predict. I always, use this word that I pretty sure is just made up, but like this, I always call it the multi-variability of this, where every single thing that we see, every stat that we see, all of that we're trying to predict here, there's so many variables. It's really hard for us to know the actual physical condition of every player in a sport that grinds its players down. And that can just end for anybody at any point. On the last podcast I did, we talked about Juju Smith-Schuster for a moment. That's a guy who came out age 21, age 22, was a superstar as a really young player. That ended up being his prime. 23 and beyond basically was never the same. And a lot of that was injury related. And so you have those concerns when you're trying to make the evaluations in the offseason. An example for this year is like Nick Chubb. Where are we at with Nick Chubb? That was a monster knee injury, but this is a guy that at every stage of his career, I've wanted to bet on being an absolute athletic outlier, just like an outlier period. His efficiency and all these things are so unique to the position of running back. There are so few running backs that could consistently be as great as Nick Chubb. But then he has a knee injury like this, and you're like, man, it's really hard to come back from a multi-ligament knee injury like this. What does that mean? Are we never going to see the same Nick Chubb again? And I mean, in all reality, that's probably the case. I mean, it's a scary thing, and that's one of those big variables we don't know. And then in addition to that, we don't know. In addition to the player's health that we're evaluating, we don't know the teammate health. We don't know if the team's quarterback is going to get injured and they're going to have a backup that completely derails the whole offense. New York Jets, right? I was way in on Garrett Wilson last year and Breece Hall. Breece Hall still was pretty successful. It really hurt Garrett Wilson to go immediately from Aaron Rodgers and have Zach Wilson again for his whole second season in the league. Garrett obviously also had Zach Wilson for all of 2022 in his rookie season. This guy's played 2 years. I think he's been one of the best receivers in the league. None of his stats show it because most of the time he's played, he's been playing with Zach Wilson, who I think is a pretty poor quarterback. So we don't know how that's going to impact our bets, because the reality is, like, yeah, you can say, oh, the Jets don't have a very good backup, but the reality is if Aaron Rodgers stays healthy the whole year, it's a completely different evaluation on Garrett Wilson, right? Like, I'm not even going to say that for sure Garrett Wilson would have been a smash. I think he would have had a great year. He looked incredible when he was playing in 2023. But the reality is we don't know whether Aaron Rodgers is going to be healthy for the whole year or not. And if he is, or if Zach Wilson's playing, those are two completely different evaluations. So what do you do? Like, how do you make that decision? A different one where it's not even as clear from a talent perspective necessarily, but going into last year with the Colts, you had Anthony Richardson, who was going to run the ball a ton and be a pass attempt issue for the Colts, and Gardner Minshew, who is more of a high pass volume kind of guy, lower ADOT, and racks up a lot of attempts through kind of matriculating the ball down the field and some of that stuff. And so it was like, okay, if Anthony Richardson's the quarterback for like a Michael Pittman, I'm a little worried about team pass volume. If Gardner Minshew's the quarterback, I actually think it's a really nice setup for team pass volume and for Michael Pittman. And I wrote about this last year. This is a contingency, we have to consider with Michael Pittman. I probably don't love his price if it's Anthony Richardson, but if Minshew plays it all this year, maybe Richardson as a rookie gets benched. Who knows? Well, he ends up playing only 4 games and Minshew plays most of the season. And I think that was really fantastic for Pittman in 2023. Those types of things is the key variable, not even related necessarily to the individual player, but to the players around him and how that impacts volume and things like that. Then you have scheme. Then you have the Arthur Smith. What does it meant with Arthur Smith and the Falcons? Then you have offensive lines and how that is, can be so damaging for a whole offense. It can be damaging for a passing game just as much as a run game. But obviously we think about it in terms of how's a running back going to do anything behind a terrible offensive line. A guy like Derrick Henry's a great example there. He actually had pretty good advanced metrics last year, despite all of his efficiency numbers being much, much worse and him being a lot older. But maybe now going to Baltimore, he still has a little bit in the tank at an older age. There's so many things. There's so many variables that we have to consider that make football a really, really difficult evaluation. And so anyway, that was all a huge tangent off of your question about the evolution of the industry and why I think best ball is a really fun thing as well, because you can draft a whole bunch of teams at low costs. It's not a huge deal if you lose one. The whole idea is like we draft a portfolio of teams. We're hoping to find 1 or 2 great teams. It's a fun way to play the sport where you're not as committed because there's so many things that you can't actually predict. Whereas, like, for instance, with Dynasty, you're committed to all these players forever. If something really bad happens with them or it impacts, with them individually, or they have a bad season for any of the reasons I just discussed related to scheme or teammates or anything like that, it can impact their valuation or the pricing in Dynasty. And so if you're trying to get a trade done or something, it can get a lot harder because you think the guy's better than his stats say he is. And there's just so much uncertainty in football that, anyway, the ways that we consume it, the ways that we gamble on it ultimately, right? The ways that we want to compete in our analysis of it have changed. I think best ball is a really fun way to move forward with that. The betting landscape, DFS, all of that is always, I think, going to be there. Those are great ones, but all that stuff has changed over time and continues to evolve. And yeah, I mean, it's fun to think about where we'll go next.
fantasy football really is that different strokes for different folks type of gaming, right? It really is. You mentioned a little bit about injuries and all this other fun stuff. We had an argument there talking dynasty on startups. And I did say in one argument, like one guy's like anti-running back, and I get it. I mean, it's the most volatile position out there, shortest lifespan. But my argument was I'm going to take the talent over the position more often than not. So give me a talented running back over a wide receiver 3 or 4, depending on where they kind of fall in the draft. So that's one of those interesting debates when you look at dynasty because of the longevity of certain positions and whatnot. So when you play, what is your preferred method? You said best ball, dynasties there, redraft, DFS. What is your preferred method of play?
The big thing that attracted me to Rotoviz and why I reached out to them initially and wanted to go right there was the logic and the arguments behind the idea of zero RB. So I started there in 2015. I mentioned the zero RB article had come out in 2013, which is Sean Siegel's initial article about zero RB. A lot of people know the idea of zero RB, but don't even maybe know the real history behind it as well, because Sean's kind of a little bit of a independent, some might call him a recluse. He's a good friend of mine. We do a podcast, Stealing Bananas, together and have for years, but he's not the type that would go out on social media and like try to demand credit for anything or anything like that. So the conversation around zero RB kind of took on a life of its own for a lot of years there, outside of the purview of the person who actually coined the term and wrote up the first article and argued that this was a very interesting theory. But the concept of zero RB does drive a lot of what the central tenets of it, a lot of what I believe about fantasy football. And to your point about running backs, I think that's the major part of it. And the idea is not that running backs aren't important. It's not that elite running backs can't score in dominant ways. They absolutely can. That's the way that the market has always valued it. It's less so this year. Running backs are starting to get cheaper. They got cheaper last year as well. But you do have sort of greater bust risk, greater concern for injury, greater concern for just circumstantial struggles. When people do the big analyses and try to show the different bust risks, there will always be people who will point out like this guy, well, he still finished RB10, and it's a name that you're like, man, that guy was a killer last year. And there's always guys that finish RB10 because they played 17 games, right? Or they used to be 16 games, but they weren't very good, but they were good enough because there's just not that many running backs who get enough touches over 16 or 17 games to even, be in the back end of the top 10, basically. There's usually only 6 or so really big difference-making running backs for a full season. The other part of it is that there are chunks of seasons where there are difference-making running backs, and that's a big part of the zero RB philosophy and strategy. I've taken to calling that concept an idea of building a Frankenstein RB for your season-long teams where you're trying to hit on ceiling games. You're trying to hit on big weeks throughout the year. You're thinking of your RB slots in your lineup as RB slots, RB1 and RB2, not like finding a player. Like it's all great when you have Christian McCaffrey and you know that he's your RB1, and I have Christian McCaffrey on my team, but that's a lot harder to do in practice than it is. You think you have that on draft day. You think you drafted this running back that's going to lock in there. But what we know about the running back position is that is usually fool's gold. And when I say usually, I mean it very literally. It's rarer for that to actually be what you get for 17 games. That's a relatively rare outcome. And so the whole concept of zero RB and all of that is, okay, well, this is the position where guys emerge and there's so much uncertainty, and you can try to cobble together a Frankenstein running back and all of this type of stuff. How do you play it? And the idea is, particularly from a cost perspective, an opportunity cost perspective, you want to be investing at the positions that are a little easier to predict, have a little bit of a higher floor. If you go look at the receivers at the top every year, it's the guys that we knew were good going in, because earning volume is a skill, and you don't get 150 targets by being in a good offense, or in a good situation or whatever. You get them by being a superstar. I mean, that's what it comes down to, getting open 150 plus times, and the ball comes your way 150 times. And so I've always been one that's like, I want to use my draft capital at that position that I think is way more talent based and a lot less opportunity based. I do still think, running back talent matters and is important to evaluate and understand as it relates to, the range of outcomes and the probabilities that we're weighing. But for me, in almost every format in Dynasty across the landscape, I want to be, other than basically like DFS, because DFS is a different conversation because who's healthy and what the matchups are for that 1 week. If you're talking about a 1 week timeline, then I don't mind paying up for running backs, right? There's guaranteed touches at running back at DFS. That's great. But anything that's a longer timeline, you start to get into any of the redraft or full season best ball stuff. And then you start to talk about Dynasty in an even longer timeline, multiple years. I want more of my eggs in the wide receiver basket. I tend to be a pretty big fan of the elite tight end strategies. Want a difference maker there if I can find one. I usually try to cobble together later round quarterbacks where possible, but the whole quarterback position has changed so much too, where there's an advantage to spending draft capital at quarterback as well. So all these other positions, the opportunity cost to not using those picks early, you lose something. At running back, you lose something, but I don't know if you lose as much. I don't think it's as hard to replace later. So that would be kind of the general philosophy for me is I want a lot of depth at receiver in every format I can find it, because I think it's more skill-based, and I want to try to hit running back a more opportunity-based position through leading into the uncertainty of it all.
I just love playing devil's advocate in an argument in general. It's I take a lot of pride in it. Like, I like to turn it into like a lamb chop song. This is the argument that never ends. It goes on and on, my friend. We saw that. I mean, people like to throw out the injury risk associated with the running back position. Well, you could throw that same argument out towards the quarterback position based on what we saw last year. And then that trickle-down effect, the quarterback getting hurt probably affects the wide receivers more than the running. I mean, you could go on and on and on about it. I mean, we're basically fantasy weathermen, right? We're not going to hit 100% every single time we go out there. You have to be really talented to like even hit 750 when it comes to fantasy. But speaking of talent, I did hear somewhere along the way that you are quite the talented bocce ball player. And I need to know about this bocce ball skill and how much trash talk can a young Canadian give an expert bocce ball player before he shuts them up?
This must be Jacob Sanderson. He lives up in Vancouver, BC. I'm in Seattle. He came down and visited last summer, and I took him out to a few bars, and one of them has the indoor lawn bowling bocce ball. I played some bocce ball growing up with my dad and my family and stuff. I wouldn't say I'm a bocce ball expert, but he got out to an early lead. He was hot. He was feeling it. He's doing, he's getting a little excited, talking a little bit of crap for sure. I'm I don't know, 10 years older than him. So I had to show him some of the wily vet skills, come back and start navigating my way back into the matchup and win, and remind him that he's got a little bit more practice to do until he can come beat the old man. I think we then played again, and I think I won the second time too. I know he didn't beat me. It was either one game or two games I beat him. I think we played again, and I just beat him more handily the second time. Anyway, Jacob, I don't know that I'm a bocce champion. I just think you're probably not that good.
Yeah, he may have learned his lesson not to use the word old man while trash talking there in a bocce, because that's going to wake the bear a little bit. Now, you mentioned, Sean, you guys got the stealing bananas thing going on. What was your initial reaction when you saw Will Levis eating a banana, peel and all? I mean, do you guys get some kind of royalties on that? Because that feels like something that you guys could have worked on.
I mean, that's a great point. I don't think I've ever made that connection. I know exactly what you're talking about. But yeah, that was a bizarre thing. And it's so funny. I mean, when we talk about fantasy analysis, let's talk about the multivariability of it all. Like, one of the things we don't ever really talk about is like, these are humans and what their personalities are and how they, exist and everything. George Pickens comes to mind as a guy who seems to have a really interesting personality and be kind of a goofball. we were talking about Juju earlier. You know, how did his personality impact his career? There's some people that think it impacted it greatly. That kind of stuff as well is like, it always, you know, ideally you'd want the players that you're investing in fantasy football to just be like 100% focused on football. And every day they wake up and they do 2-a-days and they work out and they eat perfectly healthy and they have 2% body fat. And all they're worried about is they're spending all their money on, you know, people to work on their body and massage therapy and everything that could possibly make them ready to go on Sunday and then rehab till the next Sunday. And, you know, if you had every player that had that and you knew that they were completely dedicated and all that, it would make the analysis easier. And then you got guys that are just eating banana peels, and I don't even know, like, I don't want to know the other decisions you're making in your life, man. Like, this opens up too many cans of worms for me.
We had, unfortunately, Tara Roberts couldn't be with us, but she ended up losing a bet where she had put mayo in her coffee, a la Will Levis, and the experience wasn't so well for her. I mean, Will Levis was just wired a little bit differently. But let's kind of circle back to UW here, because I want to do some blind rankings on UW quarterbacks. Once you use a quarterback in that spot, you can't put him back anywhere else. So just keep that in mind while we're doing this. I think we've all seen the blind rank thing kind of go out there. So I'm going to start it off. You mentioned his name at the top of the show there, Brock Huard. Where do you have him in your top 5 as far as quarterbacks at the University of Washington?
So people might not know this. UW has a really strong history of quarterbacks. It dates back to like Sonny Six Killer. Warren Moon went there. Chris Chandler, who played in the Super Bowl with the Atlanta Falcons in 1998. You got the Billy Joes, Billy Joe. I think it was Billy Joe Hobart or Billy Joe Tolliver. It's not the Billy Joes. It's one of them went to UW. This is kind of before my time. Now I'm dating myself, but now I'm looking it up now. Billy Joe Hobart was the UW QB when they won the national championship in 1991. There's some great ones since then. So when I've never done this, I know exactly what you're talking about, this blind ranking. I've never done it before, but you always have to leave some room, when you rank stuff. I'm going to put Brock Huard, who was the quarterback when I was a kid. I actually met him on campus once, and he like shook my hand and was like super friendly and all of this stuff. Great guy. I'm going to put him like in the pantheon of UW quarterbacks, which is really, really strong. I'm going to put him 4.
That's fair enough. This is like when I started researching, like I knew there were some good quarterbacks here. Then I started like pulling up the list. I'm like, okay, this is gonna be a little bit more difficult to put it together. So I didn't really get any kind of jobbers out there, because there wasn't a lot of jobbers that are associated with the University of Washington. So you got Brock Huard there at number 4. What about Mark Brunell?
Yeah, there's one I didn't mention. The lefty. So, I mean, what do we talk like? Because he was great in the NFL, but he was actually on that same championship winning team as Billy Joe Hobart, but I think was like played behind. He was like not the starter until Billy Joe Hobart left. And then he started 1 year, I think. I just pulled up his stats to try to figure, like, he didn't play a ton. He was a 5th round pick. He didn't play a ton in college, but an awesome player in the NFL. Again, a little bit before my time. I was born in 87. This is the early 90s when he was in college. But I remember watching him with the Jacksonville Jaguars when I was, 8 years old or whatever, and loving it. I mean, he was awesome. In terms of like UW quarterbacks, I'm going to put him 5 because he didn't do a whole lot at UW. And I think the other 3 names you're going to give me are going to be some fun names.
They'll be interesting names, because this next one was a 1st-round draft pick there, and he didn't quite materialize as an NFL quarterback. So you've got Brock Huard at 4. You've got Mark Brunell at 5. Where do you got Jake Locker?
Oh, I should have kept 5 for Jake Locker. I thought about putting Brunell 3. Yeah, I'll put Locker 3. Locker's another one. He grew up in the Seattle area, north of Seattle. I think he went to Ferndale High School, which is he's like about my age. It's in the same district as some of my really good friends from UW. So they played against him in high school, or their schools played against him. And this is a guy that, about my age in high school was like I think the state player of the year, ran out like a 4.3 40, right? Was a baseball player as well. Incredible athlete. But those were the darkest times of the UW era, was when he was the quarterback. We just got worse at about that time. It's not totally his fault. But I also, as much as I was a big fan of his, I also didn't expect him to be worth that top 10 draft capital that he got. Incredible athlete, not a very accurate passer, incredible arm strength as well. So he had the prototypical QB build, big dude, could run and had a cannon, but just not accurate. And to me, accuracy is the most important part of the quarterback position. He had a lot of opportunities. I remember the defining trait for me about Jake Locker is having guys open for deep shots downfield and overthrowing them, just consistently sailing these deep balls where you're like, that's a walking touchdown. You have to have that. And I mean, the really devastating part was the year that he got injured. We ended up going 0-12. It was the first winless year in UW history. But before that Locker era, we had gone 25 years without a losing record or something like that. Then the years I was in college, we had a year we went 0-12. And let me tell you, we did not stay sober for a lot of those games.
Yeah, those years may have caused a lot of problems in the Washington area there. Now, we got Brunell at 5. We've got Hewitt at 3 or 4. We got Locker at 3. How about last season's quarterback there, Michael Penix, number 2 or number 1?
I'm going to give him 2. I was saving 3 for him because of the other 2 that I was hoping might be coming on this list. I'm interested to hear who you left off. I'll give Penix 2. I'm not super high on Penix going to the NFL either. I've had some fun debates with some of my UW brethren who are a little more excited about him and think the fact that he's a winner and did some awesome stuff for us is getting overlooked a little bit by some, and they were really vindicated when he went in the top 10 and they were proud of that, and I think that's awesome to see. Penix was great to watch, and the UW team in these last couple of years was incredible, but their scheme and their system was really, really a fantastic scheme. And one of the things I joke is, he somewhat similar to Jake Locker would miss on some of those deep throws. People talk about his arm strength and he's got huge hands. He throws a great spiral and some of the great throws he made. The joke that I always give is he'd miss some throws. He'd be like, you can't miss that throw. Like I was just saying with Jake Locker. And then the very next play, we'd have a dude running wide open downfield again because we were just so vertical and we had such good receivers, 3 drafted in the first 2 days. And it's like, well, I guess you can miss it. If you're just going to get an opportunity on second down to throw, you missed Roma Dunze, you just threw a TD to Jalen Polk the very next play. Like, it doesn't actually matter that much when the guy on the next play is just getting open downfield as well. And the scheme is willing to just continue to push the ball. I think that covered up some of his flaws and some of the inconsistencies was the actual scheme and all that. He ran an incredible 40 time, but you never see that in the numbers because he didn't actually really scramble, didn't really want to take a lot of hits. He had a lot of injuries in college. You understand why, and we were glad that he stayed healthy and did what he had to do to get through a whole season and took us all the way to the national championship. I mean, obviously that's an incredible year for him, but I know Hayden Winks had a great stat earlier this offseason about Penix under pressure going I think it was under pressure on 3rd and 4th downs. He threw short of the sticks every time, and they never converted the first down once. If the defense got a pressure, an actual pressure in the stat book on a 3rd or a 4th down, the Huskies didn't convert a first down all year. And a large part of that is Penix didn't want to try to extend plays. He didn't want to step into hits. He wanted to just kind of throw the ball away or check it down under the sticks and just give up on the play, which is, that sounds so derogatory and like he wasn't strong enough to stand in there. I'm not trying to put it that way. I'm a big fan of his, but I do think that's going to be tricky at the next level because he had a really good offensive line and we had a good scheme and all those things that helped keep him upright and give him the opportunity and a lot of receivers to throw to. Everything's a lot trickier at the next level in those regards. So we'll see. I'm hopeful for him. Again, an awesome guy to root for and gave us Husky fans an incredible season this year, an incredible 2 seasons. We had a great year in 2022 as well. But yeah, I'm going to put him 2. I'm going to leave number 1 open here.
That was probably a good decision. There's so many quarterbacks I could have put in here. Maybe I could throw in some wrenches in here, but I could not leave the greatest quarterback ever, or one of the greatest quarterbacks ever to play in the Canadian Football League. I got to tie the show together here. The one and only Warren Moon. Put some respect on the man's name. And He's done that right here.
There is one quarterback, probably because I was a young man when or I mean, not even a young man, a 10 or 12-year-old that when he was playing quarterback at UW that I think I would have ranked higher if you would have said it. And that's Marcus Tuiasosopo. That guy was awesome.
I did look at his name, but here's the problem. I can't pronounce his name, so I didn't want to even take that chance to put him on the list.
That's fair. He became the first quarterback in college football history against Stanford in like 2001 to throw for 300 and run for 200 in the same game. So he ran the option offense, but also was a great passer. And again, I mean, I was that age where I just loved this guy. He was the other one that I thought I wanted to keep open those top couple slots, but Warren Moon was the other one. Tuiasosopo and Warren Moon were the guys that, like, if I would rank 1-2 as far as Husky quarterback history, Warren Moon was awesome. I was looking at my closet right now as I was saying that. I used to have a Warren Moon jersey. I was wondering if I still had it kicking around out there. I had an old Warren Moon Vikings jersey. I mentioned I was a Vikings fan as well in the pros, and he also played for the Seahawks. I'm a Seattle guy, so he was also a little before my time in his college days, and then he played in the Canadian Football League, which was still before my time. But by the time he finally made it to the NFL in the 90s is when I was starting to pick up the game as a young kid, and he was super fun at that time. I mean, he was an awesome quarterback, one of the first great black quarterbacks. I mean, an awesome human being. Warren Moon rules.
Maybe the tightest spiral ever thrown by a quarterback. I mean, he could sling it. He had the rings from the CFL before he even came down, created the Edmonton Eskimos dynasty way back when. 2 more questions for you here before I let you go. What have you learned through fantasy football? What has it really taught you about yourself?
That's a good question. What has fantasy football taught me about myself? I think that's tricky. It's taught me patience. I used to take it a lot more seriously than I should. It's taught me that things are sort of out of my hand. I think I've gotten a lot better at understanding when, you get tough breaks in this. I've gotten a lot better at understanding that as I've gotten older. It's taught me, the idea of probabilistic thinking and process over results and those kinds of concepts where, like, it's hard to really you can say process over results and you can understand it in theory, but results are results, man. Like it's hard to tell yourself that what actually happened wasn't the only possible way that something could have played out. And that at the decision point that you made the decision, you were weighing a lot of factors, and maybe some of those other factors could have pushed us toward a different result. And what you knew at that time, while maybe wrong, even in some cases, maybe, you were just flat wrong. In what you knew, at least, or what you assumed, or the assumptions you were making. What you knew at that time was all that you knew, and you have to make your decision based on the assumptions in front of you. And so it's more about the analysis and the process and all of that, and understanding, you're not always going to get it right. And when it comes to missing on the result side, to not then chase things that, I see a lot of young analysts start changing up their whole process because they had one key miss and they're kind of just chasing last year's miss. They want to find this year's version of some breakout player that's like, there's never another that, there's not going to be this year's Kyron Williams. There's not going to be a this year's Puka Nacua. Both those guys were super rare in 2023. And so you get, it's the idea of building a process over time and trusting in the analysis and in the process side of it, and accepting that there's going to be misses, and you're playing a hobby and doing an analysis in these things that there are a lot of factors that you can't really calculate. There's seasons like the 2022 season where a lot of my key players just got hurt. I was in on Breece Hall and Javonte Williams. They both blew their knees out. I was big on Trey Lance, who, he ended up getting traded and not starting and probably wasn't very good. I still contend if he actually stays healthy with that San Francisco offense, he probably has a pretty good year with how mobile he is and all that. That was the whole thesis, is he's going to run a lot, etc. He only played 1.5 games, and everyone's convinced that he was definitely going to be horrible that year. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But you run into that some years where all the guys that you're really in on get injured at the same time. And you have to just accept that a lot of it is out of your control. There's a lot of other stuff in your life that's great. And anyway, those are important lessons that it's silly, but fantasy football has taught me that stuff.
I mean, it really is. It's one of the most humbling experiences you can have all together. Now, as the intro music kind of starts, or the exit music starts to cue in there, just kind of give one last piece of advice for those who are trying to get into the industry, or one piece of advice that you wish maybe you knew earlier on in your career.
Oh, man. There's a lot of angles to go with that. I'll say kind of believe in yourself idea, right? Trust your own instincts, your own skills, what your competitive advantage is, what you can differentiate at. Like, it takes a lot of work, but if you wanna be awesome at this, like, you're gonna have to be both good, and you're gonna have to understand how you're good and how you're different, and what value you can add. I think there's too many young people that are trying to do content in every kind of way and trying to be the best at everything. Like, I stopped doing DFS content a few years ago. I do some sports betting, and I do season long, and I do a little bit of dynasty, but I kind of stopped doing that too, because it's like I don't know a lot of people that can be great analysts in every area of especially like during a season. You're trying to analyze all of these different things. You're trying to analyze season long. You're trying to analyze the sports betting market, and you're trying to analyze DFS every week. I mean, good luck. But there's some that can do it. I'm not trying to say it's impossible, but I would, for me, I would tell people to consider the areas that they're good, where they add value, what their unique experience is, that adds value and makes them a differentiator, and it makes them worth listening to, and lean into that stuff. Don't try to do the stuff that you don't think you're adding anything above the noise and above the fray that everyone else is doing.
One last little bit here, because we got the chasing ships, we got stealing bananas, we got stealing signals. Where else can people find Ben Gretch here?
Yeah, the newsletter, Stealing Signals, is at bengretch.substack.com. It's a premium newsletter, but you can also sign up for the free one, and you'll get plenty of free emails as well. I just launched the podcast with that, which has been years, but I have the Stealing Bananas podcast that you mentioned, the Ship Chasing podcast, other podcasts that I do. I just launched this week a new YouTube live stream, Stealing Signals podcast. You'll get emails at that Substack telling you when I'm going live and talking through some underdog drafts, things like that. If you want to listen to some of my sort of solo pods and some of these kinds of rants, that's a good place to look for that as well. So that's my new project.
All right, and just like that, hey, I'm Matt Donnelly. He's Ben Gretch, and I say don't be go chasing waterfalls when you go chase ships. We'll see you next time. Take care.